What happens when one man tries to watch all the horror films of the 1940s? Well, we're about to find out because I'm your host, Josh Spiegel, and this is the 40s Project. Believe it or not, even though this episode is only 1945, there's only 3 episodes left of the 40s Project. This episode is going to cover all of 1945. The next episode is going to cover 1946. And then with few horror releases, there's going to be one episode that covers everything from 47, 48, and 49, because there just wasn't a lot of horror movies produced in that era. And it's even starting to die down here in 1945, as we're about to find out. But there's still a couple of major hitters coming up. So let's dive right in and take a look and see what this year has to bring.
This year starts off skipping January entirely and going straight to Valentine's Day, February 14th, for a film that premiered in St. Louis and then had more cities added later in the year, and it's The Body Snatcher. It's set in Edinburgh in 1831, and a woman is bringing her daughter, who is paraplegic, to see Dr. McFarlane. She's taken there by good old Boris, showing up early in 45 as the cab man. It turns out that little Georgina has a tumor on her spine, but the doc can't operate on her because he's just so damn busy. But then, when one of his students tells him that he's planning to leave school as he can no longer afford it, the doc takes him on as assistant and moves into his house. That night, though, Donald is woken up by some strange noises outside, which turns out to be John Gray delivering a cadaver for dissection. Donald figures out that the man is actually a grave robber, but McFarlane convinces him that it's necessary for them to continue their noble work. Turns out that McFarlane's nickname is Toddy, so I wonder if he's gonna waste a bunch of money on some baseballs. Gray kills a street singer and brings Donald the body, so he realizes that the cabbie isn't just robbing graves and is instead murdering people. When he tells the doc, it's overheard by the school janitor, and hey, look at that, it's Bela Lugosi for his first appearance of the year, and the first film to feature both Boris and Bela since 1940s, you'll find out. When McFarlane gives in and decides to operate on Georgina, and it doesn't work, things get sticky as there's murder, blackmail, and more murder. And this is another one from Robert Wise, who is really picking up some traction here. And we had just seen him last year with Curse of the Cat People, and as I said there, this guy would go on to be huge and win Oscars. This particular film was produced by RKO with Val Lewton at the head, and since Karloff was unhappy with the direction Universal was taking, he signed on for a few films here. It was adapted from a story by Robert Louis Stevenson, although the story was altered a bit to beef up the character of Gray for Karloff. Also, when it was suggested that adding Lugosi would be a great selling point, they wrote the role of Joseph especially for him. It would end up being the final time that the two horror titans would appear on screen together. The film was a hit, earning around $500,000 worldwide, and the reviews were decent, with most referring to it as a classier horror picture and commending Karloff's performance. And this is pretty solid. I'm going to give it 3 out of 5 reels. I find it a bit stuffy and slow at times, but there's some nice character stuff happening and it looks great. Its horror cultural significance is a 2.5 since it's lesser known, but does have 2 legends in it and has Wise at the helm. Should you watch it? Yes, you should. Snatch it up.
This is how they did it, Joseph.
One day later, on February 15th, we had another number, this one a Poverty Row flick, and it's Fog Island. This begins with a bunch of fog, go figure, and a man lurking outside of a house. There's a young woman inside, but also George Zucco for his first appearance in 45, and also his last, since the other films he did this year were action and crime stuff. Seems Leo here recently was released from jail, and it seems like the guy outside is a former business associate. Leo's wife was murdered, and he theorizes that one of his old crew was responsible and got him put away to get him out of the picture. He invites them all to come out to Fog Island, including none other than Lionel Atwill for his first 45 show, and they all reluctantly agree to head out there. And damn, this place really lives up to its name. There's an unexpected guest, though, with the son of one of his former partners, and this dude moves right on in with Leo's daughter. He starts the festivities by giving everyone some sort of object that seems to have some relevance to them, and they try to unravel the game that Leo has concocted for them, which includes hidden passages and a seance. Pretty soon, everyone starts to come apart as the secrets start to spill. So, like I said, this is Poverty Row, a low-budget film from a B studio, and this one was PRC, the Producers Releasing Corporation. The director here was Terry O. Morse, and this is the first that we're seeing him, but he's done a bunch of crime stuff before this. His biggest claim to fame, though, is that he's the man who directed the American segments that were added into the original Godzilla, and he edited those as well. This movie was based on a play from 1937 called Angel Island, and it's been said that the rights to this play cost the studio $30,000. However, many historians have claimed that this number likely isn't accurate considering the extremely tight purse nature of PRC and the reluctance to spend that sort of money on anything. There's not much info on its success or lack thereof, although it's not a very reputed film, but it is one of the few times we got to see Zuko and Atwill go head to head. And I'll go 2.5 on it. The whole premise is intriguing, but it doesn't do enough with it, and the whole middle is just a bunch of killing time, really. Its HCS is just a 1.5 since it's not well known at all and is a bit lost to time, but I'll give it the extra 0.5 for having the Atwill Zooks double combo. Should you watch it? You can likely pass, but it's fine. This next one had a premiere on March 1st in New York City, but then went wide on March 3rd, and it's The Picture of Dorian Gray. And I never know to spell Gray with an A or an E, so thankfully you can't see what I have in my script, so you'll just have to guess. We have a painter named Basil Hallward, and he's done a portrait of a young man named Dorian Gray, and he tells his friend Henry that there's something unusual about it, and it feels like it has some sort of power. Dorian is there, and they discuss their philosophies, and he becomes aware of his own youth and the fact that it will fade. He makes a wish in front of the painting, hoping that he will always stay young while the artwork would grow old instead. He says he would give his soul for it, and we get a splash of color when we look at that painting. At a show, he meets the lovely Sybil Vane, who looks like she's about to rote some murder, and they start up a fling and get engaged, and he shows her the painting and reads her a poem by Oscar Wilde, but then breaks things off, crushing Sybil's heart. Afterwards, he notices some changes in the portrait and wonders if his wish came true, and when he finds out that Sybil killed herself, he decides to only live a life of sin and debauchery. He locks the painting away, and as time goes on, he keeps his youth and falls for Gladys Hallward, daughter of Basil, who Dorian knew when she was a little kid, so that's weird. But Gladys is also played by America's sweetheart, Donna Reed. Problem is, she's already with some rat from some pack. So then, Dorian has to deal with the way that he's seen by society and struggle with the perils of falling to the dark side. And this was another adaptation of the classic Oscar Wilde story, The Picture of Dorian Gray, from 1890. It was the first version on film from the sound era, and there were about 5 from the silent age, and of course there would be many more. This one was directed by Albert Lewin, who is most known for writing and producing, and actually only directed 7 movies, with this being his 3rd. This one changes the original text quite a bit, including some of the added romantic subplots and some tweaks that they had to make in order to appease the censors. The budget was pretty chunky for the area, just under $2 million, and it was longer than a standard film at around 2 hours. However, even though it earned a ton of accolades and strong reviews, it didn't make much of a big splash at the box office, only earning back about $1.5 million, accounting for a loss of money for MGM. It would do well at awards time though, earning 3 Oscar nominations for Best Art Direction, Best Supporting Actress for Lansbury, and Best Cinematography, and it won for cinematography. Lansbury also won a Golden Globe for her role and has since gone on to earn a bunch of respect for its extravagance. And I like it, but I also find it a bit stuffy, so I'll go with a 3.5 though. When you're talking about Oscar Wilde adaptations, I'm expecting a bit more excess and zip, and this is a touch dry, but it's still a lovely film. Its significance is a 3 as well, since I feel like some don't really peg it as horror, and it's not really a mainstream kind of film that's hugely seen, but it won an Oscar and has several big names in it. Should you watch it? Yep! Picture this. We now move on to a film that debuted in the UK on March 20th with a premiere in London, but then went wider on May 28th, and didn't make it to the US until 1949, and it's A Place of One's Own. We meet the Smedhursts, a remarkably British name, and they've just retired, and they purchase a new place, and Mr. Smed is James Mason, who we last saw in The Night Has Eyes, and it seems like everyone is afraid of their place because it's said to be haunted. They hire a young woman to help around the house named Annette, and it's Margaret Lockwood, who we haven't seen since The Lady Vanishes in the 30s, and she doesn't normally do horror-related flicks. Trouble starts when Annette finds herself taken over by some sort of force playing the piano. She starts a romance with a local doctor, and they end up getting engaged, and things are kinda low-key for a while, but then it ramps up, and Annette starts walking around and pounding on doors, looking for someone named Dr. Marsham. Turns out that a young woman named Elizabeth died there 40 years ago, and they theorize that it's her spirit returned and looking for her lost love. And this is a British film directed by Bernard Knowles, and was actually his directorial debut. Before this, he was a cinematographer and worked on several classic Hitchcock films, but switched to directing here and continued in that role until the late 60s when he retired. It was based on a novel from 1940 with the same name by Osbert Sitwell, another super English name. When James Mason got the script, he was originally asked to play another part, but wanted to show his range as an actor, and requested to play Smedhurst, a character much older than he was, and they used old age makeup on him, as well as Barbara Mullen, who plays his wife. It was considered one of the Gainsborough melodramas, which was a period from 43 to 47 in which a number of Brit films were done in an overly melodramatic style and featured a number of the same actors, but all in different stories and roles, and Mason was one of those actors. However, even though it had the prestige of the actors, it wasn't quite the hit that they were hoping for. It did do well, but compared to the other films featuring Mason and Lockwood in the same era, it underperformed and didn't make as big of a dent. And I can see why, because I'm giving it a 2.5. It's just so dry and bland, and it's mostly people talking in rooms, but for a melodrama, it feels too low-key. Its HCS is just a 2, since it's not much spoken of, but it did have enough star power and got some attention, but not enough to affect the genre. Should you watch it? Maybe. That depends on how low-key you like your horror. Well, after 2 highbrow films, let's now go to something a bit zanier, with a film that ran on May 1st, even though it had a premiere back on April 26th, and it's Zombies on Broadway. It's set in New York City, and they're advertising the opening of a new show at the Zombie Hut that promises a live zombie, or a zombie in person, because a live zombie defeats the purpose. The ads were pushed by a couple of press agents working for club owner Ace Miller and his rival Douglas Walker as a radio guy who's determined to ruin him if the zombie turns out to not be real. Ace gets heated and threatens Jerry and Mike to produce a real zombie or else, so they go to see an eccentric professor who directs them to a remote island where it's said that they can find one. When they arrive, they encounter this guy from I Walked with a Zombie, singing a very similar song to the one he did there. And hey, speaking of people from that film, this guy is here too. He's once again played by Darby Jones, and it's fairly clear that these are nods of the hat to I Walked, and not that this is in continuity with it, even though they used the same island name. There's a mad doctor on that island, and yep, it's Bela Lugosi for appearance number 2 in 45. But there's also a cabaret girl, played by Anne Jeffries, who would go on to become a huge force in soap opera and TV later on. The boys go on their hunt for the zombie, but when the doc decides to line up Mike and Jerry for his next experiment, they might end up being their own zombies. And This one was produced by RKO, punching all the blocks of what was popular at the time, with the little rise of zombie-themed films and horror comedy. In fact, Alan Carney and Wal Brown were teamed up together in a number of RKO pictures and were broadly just considered a thin knockoff of Abbott and Costello.
Jerry, I know it doesn't make sense, but... Jerry! Now what?
An accusation that's pretty spot on. This one was done on the cheap, with the studio reusing sets from their Tarzan pictures as well as some from I Walked with a Zombie. It wasn't a huge hit, but it was a success, enough for them to pair the boys with Bella the following year in a comedy picture called Genius at Work. And this is okay. It's a 3. I find it mostly entertaining, even if I've seen it all before and seen it done better with guys named Abbott and Costello. Its significance is just a 2 since it's not that well known, but it's got a bit of attention and had Bella in it, so it gets a little extra boost. Should you watch it? It's probably worth a look. Get your Broadway tickets and check it out.
I declare that man does love skeletons. Right this way, gentlemen.
You first.
Me?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, me.
Well, maybe that was on the opposite end of the spectrum and too silly. So let's see if we can split the difference with a film that came out on May 10th with The Phantom Speaks. This one starts with 2 men, and one thinks that the other is having an affair with his wife, so he kills him and is arrested, being sentenced to electrocution. A reporter is assigned to the story and talks to the doctor in charge of the prisoner, and this guy has a theory that if your soul is strong enough, you can live on past your death. And Matt's worried because he's going to see Harvey right before he dies. He says that his will is the strongest that he's ever encountered and thinks that he'd be the perfect candidate for his experiment and that he can bring him back from death. The big day comes and Harvey is taken to the electric chair, and later Renwick conducts his experiment and is able to call for his spirit, but his will is too strong and he's able to take over the doc's body. He then uses him to go out and get revenge, shooting his attorney, who he felt failed him. He continues his path of vengeance, taking out his ex-wife, and it's up to Matt to figure out what's going on and to stop the ghostly killer. This one's from Republic Pictures, who we haven't seen much horror output from, but they were another Poverty Row studio that managed to transition into being a bigger budget outlet that was eventually purchased by Paramount. It was directed by John English, who had his hands in a ton of superhero stuff and directed Lone Ranger movies, Dick Tracy, Zorro, and even the old school Captain Marvel and Captain America serials. It was, again, another low-budget job and was made as part of a double bill with the very next film that we're going to talk about, and didn't really have much success at the time. However, it went on to a certain form of notoriety for another reason. At the time, in Texarkana, there was a series of murders in which 5 people were killed, with another 3 attempts. These were dubbed the Texarkana Moonlight Murders, and they referred to the killer as the Phantom Killer and the Phantom Slayer, and they did that because this was the movie that was playing at the time. And yes, those were the killings that were fictionalized and adapted into the 1976 film, The Town That Dreaded Sundown. And I'm giving this a 3. It's really nothing special, but there was some fun bits, and one moment that I found worked really well with a little girl whose daddy was just killed trying to wake him up. Its HCS is just a 1.5 though, since it's obscure and unknown, and were it not for its weird little footnote with some real life violence, wouldn't be spoken of. Should you watch it? I'd say yeah. Let this phantom say his piece.
Daddy! Daddy! Wake up! Wake up! Wake up! Wake up! Wake up, Daddy! Wake up!
Hello, Mary. Remember me?
My daddy won't wake up.
The next one came out shortly afterwards on May 21st, and it's the other part of that double bill I was just talking about with The Vampire's Ghost. It starts in Africa, and a woman is attacked and killed. And then there's a guy named Roy here, along with his girl Julie, and her dad and the locals all think that the deaths are the work of a vampire since the victims are all drained of blood. They go to this new nightclub that popped up in town to talk to the owner, an intimidated man named Webb Fallon, and ask him for his help. They head out into the brush to try to figure out what's going on, but when they get into a fracas with some natives, Fallon is speared. That reveals to Roy that he's actually a vampire, which of course freaks him out, but Roy's enchanted and commanded to keep his secret. In order to keep his vamp self under wraps, he starts to kill off other people around him, and it's up to Roy to team up with the local priest, Father Gilchrist, to defeat him. But Fallon throws another wrinklet by trying to steal Julie away and turn her into his vampire mate, making it a race against time. And yeah, like I mentioned, this is that other film for the double bill from Republic Pictures, although it was initially released on its own, but then was paired up with The Phantom Speaks for special screenings. It was directed by Leslie Salander and was his first appearance here, but he's another one of these guys who handled about a dozen westerns a year. He'd only do a few more horror-oriented flicks, and almost the entire rest of his filmography is westerns and war films. But in the late 50s, he shifted to TV and directed a ton of Lassie episodes. One interesting bit is that this was a very early writing gig for Lee Brackett, the queen of space opera as she was called, and later she'd become one of the most prominent writers of science fiction during the 50s. She even did an early draft of The Empire Strikes Back, and parts of that she wrote ended up in the final product, but she passed on before it started filming. Like The Phantom Speaks, this was also surprisingly successful, prompting Republic to stay in the horror biz, and they would head into production on another double feature, which we'll talk about when we get to 1946. And this is a good time. It's a 3. I like that Fallon isn't straight up evil, and they actually give him shades of gray, and even though the story's not really giving us much in the way of newness, the situations feel more fleshed out than the others. Its significance is just a 1.5 though, since it's not one that's discussed and is mostly forgotten, but it was a minor success and launched Brackett's film career. Should you watch it? I would, even if there's no actual vampire's ghost, so the title lies. Moving on into June now, and on the 22nd we're headed back into silly territory with a little number called Scared Stiff, although it was also called Treasure of Fear. We meet a goofy reporter obsessed with chess named Larry, and it's the Tin Man himself, Jack Haley, and his uncle is the head of the paper, and he's at the end of his rope with him. As a last resort, he sends him to a story in a place called Grape City, where there's a big winery and a festival. He heads up with his girlfriend, but gets off at the wrong bus, stopping at Grape Center as opposed to Grape City, and there's a murder on the bus that he took. The body then goes missing, and everyone is sequestered in a hotel, and Larry is implicated since the dead man had a chess piece in his hand. Larry starts to check out the area, looking for a way to get away, and he desperately wants to try to leave the cover of the festival. His girlfriend, who's an antique dealer, manages to find this rare white chess piece, and it seems like there's this ancient set that's rumored to be on the property from the time of Kublai Khan, and the twin brothers who own the place have them all split up. There's another wrinkle in that one of the people there is an escaped murderer, and the police show up looking for him, completely unaware that the bus killing even happened, kicking off shenanigans and tomfoolery and murder. This one was actually distributed by Paramount Pictures, and eventually, though a number of their horror output was more upscale and expensive, this was a B-movie made on a much lower budget. The director was Frank L. McDonald, and much like I said with Salander, he was a guy who churned out Western and war story after Western and war story, dipping rarely into horror, and this may be the only time that we encounter him here. I mentioned that Paramount distributed this, but it was actually produced by Pine Thomas Productions, which was a wing of the studio that handled their B pictures. But again, most of their output was war stories and westerns, and they did a handful of horror quickies as well. This was part of a contract that they had with Haley, and they liked the performance of Anne Savage in the film so much that they signed her up as well. It was fairly successful, but not as much as some of the other horror comedies, and it had to change its title later on when it went to television screenings. In 1953, there was another film, one with Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis, that had the same name, so they altered it to Treasure of Fear to avoid confusion. And this is okay, it's a 2.5. Haley is pretty entertaining, and the story moves along quick enough, but it's honestly just more of the same. Its significance is just a 1 since it's not known at all and is dwarfed by the other films with the same title and doesn't have any horror names involved. Should you watch it, it's probably okay to stiff this one.
Go ahead. Walk along. Keep your hands up. Don't shoot!
And now it's time for us to go back into the jungle, since the film that would be released on June 29th would be The Jungle Captive. We're at the office of a biochemist, and it's run by a Mr. Stendhal, played by Otto Kruger, who we haven't seen on the project since all the way back in 1936 in Dracula's Daughter. He has a couple of assistants, and believe it or not, but this guy right here is none other than Uncle Owen. Before being set on fire, of course. They're doing an experiment to bring a rabbit back to life, and it works. But then this large man arrives, and this should be a familiar face, because you can't forget this one, and it's the legendary Rondo Hatton. Rondo was actually a journalist, but he suffered from acromegaly, which distorted his facial features, and was cast in films due to his distinctive looks. He was in a series of films, although this is the first that we're seeing him on the project, even though he had a cameo in the 39 Hunchback of Notre Dame. Here he plays Moloch, and he steals a body from the morgue and takes it to a house in the middle of nowhere. Investigating into crime, the police are led to the doc's office, and Anna's eventually led to that house by Doc Stendhal, and it turns out that he is indeed responsible for stealing that body. But then, that body is in fact Paula Dupree, the Ape Woman, as this is the third of the Jungle Woman movies, which began with Jungle Woman and then was continued in Captive Wild Woman. The character was killed at the end of that one and is clearly still dead here, but Stendhal plans to use Anne's blood to bring her back. It works, and the Jungle Woman lives again, and they use Anne's glands to turn her human again, although she's been recast for the second time.
What's your name? Paula.
I mean, don't just give her the answer, Doc. Jeez. Simplest quiz ever.
Problem is that Paula's been brain damaged from being dead, and they just decide to give her a new one, and Anne is looking like the likeliest donor. And this is from Universal, and like I mentioned, is the third and final entry of the Sheila the Ape Woman story, the unsung Universal monster. This one was handled by Harold Young, the director of The Mummy's Tomb, and was near the ending of his career. He still directed into the 50s, but he went from doing around 10 movies a year to just doing 1 or 2. It originally had a different actress in the role of Anne, but after she showed up late for shooting and didn't know any of her lines, and then said that she couldn't shoot on certain days due to not finding a babysitter, they had to replace her. The reviews weren't great, and they would end up being a disappointment, leading to them not making any more entries with the character, and for a while it would show up on the worst horror movies of all time lists. And that's a stretch, because I'll give it a 2. I mean, honestly, it's mostly just dull, and even at just over an hour, it feels like there's not enough story to justify the runtime. Plus, there's nowhere near enough Jungle Woman action. Its significance is the same since it was part of the Universal Monster run, even though it was a much less lauded one, and didn't feature much in the way of the regular players, but it got some notoriety. Should you watch it? You can pass. I mean, there's no need to make yourself a captive of this one.
You ain't gonna do that. You told me.
Shut up, Moloch, and get out of here.
No. You ain't gonna hurt her.
Keep away from here, Moloch.
Getting deeper into the year here, and now we're headed into the fall, and on September 1st, we saw the release of Island of the Dead. We're told of an evil force called the Vorvalaka, which actually sounds like some kind of delicious pastry, and we're in 1912 during the Balkan Wars. Boris Karloff is here for his second appearance of the year, and he's a general having a discussion with a reporter. They decide to go and pay their respect to General Faradis's dead wife, and she's laid to rest on a nearby island called the Isle of the Dead. There, they discover that her crypt is trashed, but they hear a woman singing and try to track her down. Instead, they find a bunch of people at a house, including this guy, who is Jason Robards Sr., father of Jason Robards, as well as Alfred Pennyworth. They decide to stay the night and escape the front lines temporarily and sleep in actual beds, even though they're warned that there's a Vorvalaka loose and taking the form of a young Thea. The next morning, they find one of the inhabitants of the house dead in his bed, and they think that it's the plague, so they quarantine everyone in order to keep them from spreading to the army. They hope to wait it out, but when Aubin dies, they start to think that the plague is punishment for allowing the Vorvalaka to stay there, and Feridus starts to watch her like a hawk, and then plans to kill her. This is another from RKO, produced by Val Lewton, who also co-wrote the film, although he's uncredited. The director was Mark Robson, who had earlier done The Seventh Victim for Lewton as well. It was a really troubled production on multiple fronts. First of all, they started filming back in '44, but Karloff had some health issues, and they needed back surgery, and they had to suspend shooting while he recovered. Meanwhile, when he was able to film again, it took time to reassemble the cast, so they filmed The Body Snatcher in the meantime. When they did get the actors lined up, one of them, Rose Hobart, was working on something else, so they wrote her character out of the script. That was no easy task because she was the main character. Once they were able to get back to filming, though, things went smoother. The entire film was based on a painting, also called Isle of the Dead, by Arnold Bachlin, and that work of art can be seen in the opening credits. It was the highest budget yet for a Lewton horror film at around $250K, but that ended up being a disappointment at the box office and only earned a profit of $13,000. Over time, though, its reputation would grow as a cool, atmospheric horror flick, with Martin Scorsese calling it one of the scariest films of all time. And I'm giving it a 3.5. Lewton seems to constantly pick good talent to make simple horror films and then do them in a really beautiful way. The story's a bit slow, and I wish that the ending had a bit more punch, but I enjoyed this quite a bit. Its HCS is a 2.5, since it was one of the more highlighted non-Universal Karloff flicks and had Lewton's involvement, but it's just not that well known. Should you watch it? Yes, set sail for the Isle. Speaking of movies with the word dead in the title, let's go see a movie that debuted in London on September 9th, before getting a US release in June of '46, and it's Dead of Night. We meet a couple of gentlemen who are meeting up at this old country estate, and Walter here is planning on staying there for a while, and a bunch of other guests are there as well. He seems confused and then tells everyone that even though he's never met them, he'd seen them all in his dream. Everyone is perplexed, but then he starts talking about the details of his dream, and when it seems as if he can see things that are going to happen, they test it out by telling each other stories. The first is about a race car driver who gets into a wreck and is hospitalized and sees a mysterious carriageman outside the window. Later, he sees the man again before a horrible bus wreck. Next, Sally tells a story about a Christmas party in a big house full of children, or I guess adults dressed as children? She's told the house is haunted and, while playing hide and seek, encounters a little crying boy with a ghostly secret. The next story is of a mirror that's given as a birthday gift that seems to reflect a different room and the dark influence that it has. Another story is about a couple of golfers that encounter cheating and spirits with a healthy dose of love triangle. The next story is probably the most known from the film, and it's about a ventriloquist with a dummy named Hugo that seems to have a life of its own. But is all of this just stories, or are they all linked to Craig's dream? So this one is from the UK and featured several different directors on the multiple segments. They included Alberto Cavalcanti, Charles Crichton, who much later would direct A Fish Called Wanda, Basil Dearden, and Robert Hamer. During this period, when Britain was knee-deep in the war, they didn't make horror films, as they were banned, but this was produced anyway. And it did quite well, being one of the biggest box office performers of the year and received a fair share of critical accolades. It was picked up for release in the US, but the distributors found as it was too long at an hour and 45 minutes and cut out the Christmas party story as well as the golfing one. But that only served to confuse audiences when the ending of the film made reference to those stories. But then it had a bigger influence. Several astrophysicists watched the movie and pondered the circular nature of the plot and decided to develop what is known as the steady state model of the universe, an alternative to the Big Bang Theory, although various scientific flaws have been pointed out in reference to it, and it is no longer really discussed. And I love this one. It's a 4 from me. It's a fun variety of stories, and each one feels like this cool little vignette, but it all adds up to something in the end. Plus, that ventriloquist bit is one of the all-time best anthology segments. Its HCS is a 3.5 since it's more well-known and has had a ton of influence, but it's not one that really soared into the cultural mainstream, so I can't really push it that much higher. Should you watch it? Absolutely. Go on into this night.
Finished.
Suppose I tell him the truth. Suppose I tell him that you made me do it.
Try it and see what happens. They'll put you in the madhouse. But not little Hugo. Oh, no. I'm going to team up with Sylvester. Maybe we'll come and visit you. You know, private show for the loonies.
This next one takes us ahead into October as we go into the spooky season. And on October 5th, we have Strange Confession. This has Lon Chaney Jr. appearing, and in the opening credits, they just bill him as Lon Chaney. And he shows up at the house of an attorney in desperation and wants to tell him a story. He wanted to help mankind, and several years ago he started working at a laboratory. And it's Christmas time. He's married to Jane, or I guess Mary here, and they have a little baby. He's working for Roger, played by J. Carrol Naish, who we last saw in House of Frankenstein and Jungle Woman, and his good friend picked the wrong day to stop sniffing glue. He's put into a bad spot by his boss, who wants to rush out a discovery, so he resigns and is blacklisted. He has to take a job as a pharmacist, and time goes by, and his kid grows. Roger comes by his place on New Year's Eve to try to get him back, and he says no, but his wife seems to think that he should in order for them to make more money. But he's being sneaky and has someone break in and steal his notes, sending Jeff off to South America to find his breakthrough as he sets sail. Meanwhile, Roger releases the influenza drug and takes the credit, and also moves in on Mary. But then little Tommy gets sick, and the drug doesn't do anything, but only because Roger didn't have Jeff's whole formula. When Tommy then dies, Jeff swears revenge. And this is another one from Universal, but not part of the Monsters saga. It was directed by John Hoffman and was his first feature film, and he would do many more, but he had a number of additional credits as an editor. So, in the 44 episode, I discussed the Inner Sanctum mystery films, and this was another one of those. It was the 5th of the series, and they were all based on episodes of a popular radio show. It was a kind of a remake of a drama from 34 called The Man Who Reclaimed His Head, but it was unauthorized, so there was a bit of a dispute with it. So when the Inner Sanctum series was released to television later on, this one was omitted. And honestly, it's not much horror, and this is much more of a crime drama, but it makes a pretty abrupt and jarring shift in the final handful of minutes. And I wasn't too into this, so I'm going to go with a 2 here. It's mostly this melodrama plot that's not really all that involving and feels super drawn out, even at an hour. Its significance is just a 1.5 since it's not much known, but since it's part of the Universal entries that has Chaney and an early role for Bridges, it gets a slight boost. Should you watch it? Probably not. Again, there's not much horror going on here in the end.
I like my neighbors and they seem to like me. Even the kids.
It's been a while since we've had some monkey business, but that's about to change because on November 2nd we have White Pongo. It's set in the Congo with a tribe there, and they have a man captured that they plan to sacrifice. But there's also this albino gorilla lurking around. Gunderson escapes just as Pongo attacks and makes it to civilization. He tells his story, but no one believes that the gorilla exists. But a group of anthropologists team up to head out into the jungle to try to find him, because they believe that he's the missing link. They head out, and there's a bunch of gorillas out there, and they eventually find that tribe from the beginning and talk to the scientist that is staying with them. They build up a big trap for the guy, and soon enough, he starts snooping about, and there's also some human drama. But it also turns out that several members are there to hunt down a fabled gold field and take the rest of the crew hostage. And this is another one from PRC, the Producers Releasing Corporation, a Poverty Row company. It was by Sam Newfield, who we talked about back in 44 with The Monster Maker, and he also did Dead Men Walk in 43. And I know that I mentioned PRC, but they just distributed this one, and it was actually produced by a company called Sigmund Newfield Productions. And even though their last names are spelled differently, since Sigmund is N-E-U Feld, while Sam is N-E-W Field, they were brothers. And working together, Sam was one of Hollywood's busiest directors and did 350 films in his career, more than 10 per year. Inside that gorilla suit is Ray Kerrigan, and we've talked about him before as well, since he owned a gorilla suit and he was hired to be in a bunch of movies as a stunt performer in it. This one had a specially made suit since it was white and was only used here and in one other film, Man Beast from 1956, where it became a Yeti. This one also had a working title of Congo Pongo, which I really wished it had kept because it just sounds like a much more fun film. And I'm giving this one a 2. It's mostly dull with people just traipsing through the woods, but it does have its moments, particularly when it gets to the gorilla fights near the end. Its HCS is just a 1 though, since it's a very unknown title and there's no one in here that stands out. Should you watch it, you can make this Pongo a no-no. This next one had a debut in New York City on November 23rd and then went wider, and it has a vaguely familiar title with A Game of Death. It has a boat cruising through some dangerous waters, and they say that a nearby island is cursed. On the ship is a writer and a big game hunter, but then there's trouble when the ship wrecks and then freaking explodes. Most everyone is killed, but one manages to make it to that nearby island with the cursey curse. There he finds a big mansion and heads there for shelter, where he meets Carib, who can't speak, and the castle's owner, Eric Krieger. Turns out that there's a few other people there as well, who are also in a shipwreck, and everyone is waiting for a ship to come and pick them up, which they say will take a while. Eric is obsessed with hunting, but has become bored with it, saying it's no longer a challenge, but that he's found a new game.
Mine is the most dangerous game in the world.
The Most Dangerous Game, huh? That sounds like a good title. I guess you're gonna go with Game of Death.
That night, one of them disappears, and they hear a yell from outside. Go to investigate, and it turns out that Krieger is indeed hunting them. So Dawn, Ellen, and Bob have to team up to try to beat him at his own game. And obviously, this is yet another version of the 1924 story, The Most Dangerous Game by Richard O'Connell. And we've previously seen a take on that on 1932. This is a direct remake of that one, since they were both from RKO, but this one was directed by Robert Wise again, fresh off of the Body Snatcher. But like I mentioned there, he won to much bigger projects. What's interesting is that the manservant Carib, played by Noble Johnson, he played the same sort of role in the other one, although he was named Ivan in that one, and they even reused footage from the 32 version, including Johnson, as well as a few other scenes featuring Fay Wray, although the reused scenes were outtakes. They were originally going to just call this The Most Dangerous Game as well, but then changed it to A Game of Death, although no reason has been given as to why. One other change of note, given the time period, is that they changed the villain from Count Zaroff, a Russian, to Eric Krieger, a German. Obviously, given that the war was going on while they were filming this, it seemed like an obvious switch, but I guess little did they know as they were shooting that by the time the film was released, the war would be over. And this is decent. It's a 3. I think the 32 version is significantly better, and if you've seen that, this just feels like more of the same with no surprises. But it's done quite well. Its horror cultural significance is a 2 though, since it's a lesser known version of the tale, but still has some notoriety, although it doesn't feature any significant horror names. Should you watch it? Yeah, it's definitely a game worth playing. We're getting close to the end of the year now, and this next one debuted on December 7th, and it's one of the big ones with House of Dracula. The Drac is back, and it's once again John Carradine picking up the part again after he last played it in House of Frankenstein, inexplicably back to life after being dusted by the sun there. He visits a doctor and reveals to him that he's a vampire and that he's looking for a cure for his condition. Franz doesn't quite believe him, but he agrees to try anyway, and is assisted by a hunchback assistant, played by Jane Addams, who is actually the OG Vicky Vale. Turns out that someone else needs the doc's help, and it's Larry Talbot, again played by Lon Chaney Jr., but he ends up turning himself into the authorities. Inspector Holtz is our old friend Lionel Atwill, who we haven't seen since earlier on in this year, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, but it's going to be the last time that we see him. Talbot transforms, and Franz sees it and again tries to help him too. They discover the remains of the Frankenstein monster, last seen sinking into a swamp, and the doc attempts to revive him, but is then talked out of it. Things get tricky when the Count seduces Franz's other assistant and turns the doc into a vamp, with everything winding up at the castle, eventually facing off against the monster as well. And this is the latest entry in the Universal Monster Saga and was again directed by Earl C. Kenton, who did House of Dracula as well as Ghost of Frankenstein, and was originally going to be titled Wolfman vs. Dracula and would have had Bela Lugosi back as Dracula. However, there were a couple of delays, including censor issues that held it up, and they ended up going with Kenton and a different script. It used much of the same crew from House of Frankenstein and brought Glenn Strange back to play the monster, and had Atwill come back to play yet another different police inspector. Shortly after filming this one, though, Atwill would pass away from bronchial cancer, and had 2 other films released afterwards, but this was the final horror film for the great actor that's shown up so many times in the 30s and 40s projects. The reviews for it weren't that great, with most basically just saying there was more of the same, but it did pretty well, earning a profit at somewhere between $250K and $500K. Sadly though, it performed softer than the other big horror releases of the year and did better than those from the smaller studios. It would go on to become the end of the line for several of the characters, at least outside of comedy. After this, Universal Saga would focus on other characters, like the She-Wolf, and later on, Creature from the Black Lagoon, although these guys would show back up again in the Abbott and Costello Meet the Monsters films, which we'll discuss as the decade goes on. And I actually find this one kind of blah, so it's a 2.5 from me. It feels like a retread of House of Frankenstein, and to be honest, it's pretty boring. Its HCS is a 3.5 since it's the culmination of the 3-character series, the final Atwill horror film, and an all-star cast. Should you watch it? Yeah, I mean, it's not great, but it's a part of the franchise, so it should be checked out.
I will never tell.
That's right, Siegfried. You never will.
Help! Help!
1 week later, on December 13th, we're almost at the ending of the year, and here's another low-budget flick with Woman Who Came Back. It starts with telling us about the Salem witch trials, but it's set in modern times as an old woman boards a bus and freaks out another woman right before it goes off the road and plunges into a river. The woman, Lorna, survives and tells them about the woman, but they never recover her body. And they don't believe that she was there, including her boyfriend, played by John Loder, who we just saw in Game of Death. Lorna starts noticing strange things, like flowers dying near her, and she starts to believe that the old woman was a witch who made a deal with the devil. And she finds a book that says that the witch will pass her spirit into the body of a young woman, and believes that she is now that woman. She becomes obsessed with the idea, causing problems with Matt and freaking out little kids, but when the townspeople start to actually believe that she may be the witch, it looks like history might repeat itself. And this is one from Republic again, and directed by Walter Combs. It was only his second directing gig, and he'd only do 9 films, but did more as a producer. It's of note that one of his later films was called The Burning Cross and was a movie about the growing threat of the KKK, and is a great example of an early politically motivated film. And this was originally going to be titled The Web, which makes me wonder if Lorna was actually a madam, and it was clearly done because of the success of Val Lewton's flicks, since it utilizes his whole style of film. There's a moment when Lorna is walking down the street and hears the sounds of a dog collar jingling behind her that's ripped straight out of Cat People, but there's really not much information about how well it performed or the critical reviews. And I like this, it's a 3. It starts out great, but does lose steam for a bit, although it wraps things up in a pretty interesting way. Weird and enjoyable. Its HCS is just a 1 though, since it's not known at all and doesn't really feature much in the way of horror names, and it didn't dent the genre. Should you watch it? Yeah, I'd come back to this woman. The final film of 45 arrived 1 day later, on the 14th, and we're going to close out the year with The Pillow of Death. It begins with this grumpy old couple, and they have their sister over for dinner, but then we meet Wayne, an attorney, and he's having an affair with his secretary. One night he comes home and finds out that his wife has been murdered, suffocated with no signs of struggle. Seems like before she died, she was getting into the occult, befriending a psychic, and reading books about suicide. He's arrested for the murder, and his secretary backs his alibi, but there's some missing time in which he could have been there to kill her. Donna's aunt seems particularly keen on him being the killer, and they'll have a seance to contact her with the help of that psychic, and her voice accuses Wayne of the murder, but appears to be a scam. Later, though, Wayne hears her voice calling to him, but then more people start dying in that same manner, leading to a mystery and ghosts. And this was another Universal film, but also part of that whole Inner Sanctum Mysteries thing that I was talking about earlier. It was actually the final entry of the series, and again was based on the radio show with that same name, and is the only one of the 6 that doesn't start with the whole floating head and the crystal ball thing. This was directed by Wallace Fox, and we last saw him with Bowery at Midnight and The Corpse Vanishes, but looking at the rest of his filmography after this one, it seems like it'll be the last time that we see his work, because everything else looks like westerns. It's a really weird film because it's all predicated on a twist ending, and there's a bunch of red herrings thrown at you that don't lead anywhere, which makes for a kind of bizarre viewing experience. And I'm giving this a 2.5. I like that you never really know where it's going, but I'll admit that I found the finale to be a bit silly, and not in the best way, in a way that doesn't make much sense. Its HCS is a 1.5 since it's not much talked about, and again, is pretty obscure, but it's a part of the Inner Sanctum series and has Chaney in it. Should you watch it? Perhaps. I mean, it's an okay, if not earth-shattering watch.
So there you have it, all of the horror of 1945. And yeah, as you can see, starting to get a little bit thinner with what's being released out there. A lot more just B movies and kind of like quickies with no real relevance, no major stars, no major monsters, with the exception of like 1 or 2 movies. So the genre is pretty much getting quiet. In fact, I think my favorite of this particular block is, I'm going to say Dead of Night, because it's just such a very fun and cool, very innovative anthology film. But let me know which of these was your favorite down below. Let me know which of these you've seen or haven't seen or would now like to see. Tell me that in the comments. If you enjoyed this, hit the like. If you like the channel, hit subscribe. And of course, check out my Patreon page at patreon.com/movietimelines, where you can help support the project. But yeah, as I said before, after this, there's only 2 more episodes left to go in the 40s. And yeah, we're getting really close to the end of the 40s project.